Well, welcome to episode 118 of 10 Minute Record Reviews, and today I'm going to talk about Bob Dylan's debut album from 1962, Bob Dylan. So this, of course, is Dylan's debut. He's very much at this point a young man in a hurry. He's only just signed a record contract. He's not the songwriter he's going to become. There are only 2 originals on here, and all the rest, the other 11, are cover tunes. But he's clearly already an artist of depth, and there's a real contrast here between the fresh-faced kid, really just out of his teens, on the front cover, and the complexity and the emotion conveyed in the lyrics all the way through the record. Bob Dylan's backstory is pretty well known. He was born in Duluth, Minnesota in 1941. When Bob was only 6, his dad got polio, so the family had to move, and they moved to where his dad's brothers lived in Hibbing, Minnesota. In high school in the 1950s, Dylan's interest gravitated towards rock and roll, as so many other kids did around that time. But by the time he got to the University of Minnesota in his first year, his interest had migrated towards folk music. He'd already been experimenting with using stage names as opposed to Bob Zimmerman, and around this time he eventually changed to Bob Dylan, a name which he would, of course, ultimately adopt legally. By late 1960, Dylan is fully committed to folk music as a career, and he wants to go to the hub of everything, the epicenter of folk music and its revival in the United States at that time, and that, of course, is Greenwich Village in New York. But he also wants to hook up with his primary idol at the time, Woody Guthrie. He arrives in New York, January of 1961, age 20. Within 5 days of his arrival, he's actually managed to connect with Woody Guthrie, which is kind of an amazing story in and of itself. He learned, possibly by looking in the phone directory, that Guthrie's family home was in Brooklyn. So he took the subway over there and showed up at Guthrie's front door, which was entered by 13-year-old Arlo Guthrie, who of course became a folk artist in his own right. And he tells this young stranger that his dad has been institutionalized and is living in a mental hospital in New Jersey. Some years before, in 1954, Guthrie had checked himself into a mental hospital for the first time. What he actually had was Huntington's, but at that time, in the mid-1950s, the diagnostic approach to Huntington's was actually not well developed. So 2 years later, he's released onto the street with his problems unresolved, and he's almost instantly arrested by the police for vagrancy. He's taken back to a mental hospital, and this time he's diagnosed with schizophrenia because he keeps telling the staff that he's written thousands of songs and he's written a book, and they don't believe this because he looks kind of homeless. Eventually, they do realize that he is telling the truth and that he actually has Huntington's. Now, this is the part of the story where a couple of new characters enter in the form of Bob and Sid Gleason. Bob was an electrician from New Jersey, and both of them were Woody Guthrie fans. They reached out to the hospital, and they offered to host Guthrie every weekend. The family finds it easier to visit Woody there, but so do lots of his friends, including people like Phil Oakes, Pete Seeger, and other people from the Greenwich Village folk scene. And so Dylan made the trek over to East Orange, New Jersey, over to the Gleasons' apartment just 5 days after he himself had arrived in New York. When Dylan meets Guthrie, Guthrie's in a pretty bad way. He can barely move, he can barely speak, but his mind is still perfectly functional, and he loves having his own songs played to him. And Dylan has basically found his moment, so he goes through his whole catalog of Guthrie's songs, eventually goes away and writes a song for Guthrie, and comes back on another visit and plays him that song, and that Song for Woody, is actually on this record. Given the level of initiative that Dylan had shown in seeking out Guthrie in the first place, it shouldn't be too surprising to learn that he was also pretty effective at ingratiating himself in the Greenwich Village folk scene and getting gigs and becoming reasonably well known within a few months. His treatments of traditional songs make a lot of impression on the folk critics of the day, and by the end of the summer he's starting to get really good reviews, including one very influential one in the New York Times. His reputation is growing, he's meeting all kinds of people in the music scene, and in September 1961 he gets asked to play harmonica on an album by a young folk singer called Carolyn Hester. At a rehearsal session for that record, which was held at the apartment of Joan Baez's sister, Dylan finds himself seated beside the producer for the record, John Hammond of Columbia Records. When Dylan picks up a harmonica and starts to play, Hammond is struck not just by his playing, but just by the overall intensity and the presence of Dylan. So he invited Bob to come down to the Columbia studios for an audition recording, which Dylan duly did, and on the strength of that audition, Dylan was signed on the spot to a 5-year contract with Columbia Records. A lot of artists in this circumstance typically go into the studio and record their typical set list from their club dates at that time. Dylan actually wanted to find new material, so he immersed himself in archival blues and folk recordings. The album's recorded between November 20th and 22nd in 3 different sessions with John Hammond producing. Hammond, of course, had been struck by Dylan's energy and intensity when he'd met him that time around the kitchen table, and he told him when he came into the studio that he wanted to record him unaccompanied, just Bob's voice with his guitar and harmonica. For Hammond as producer, Dylan's intensity proved to be a bit of a challenge in the studio. Dylan was untutored in the studio arts. He was unwilling to correct the kinds of minor flaws and verbal tics, which Hammond would typically correct in other artists. He also was very uninterested in doing second takes. He would basically say, actually, I think it's a terrible idea to play a song twice. I've played it once. And as a consequence, there are only a few songs on here which are done in anything other than one take. Dylan also arrived at the studio feeling kind of insecure about his guitar playing. And to compensate for that, he ends up playing rather rapidly. It's also possible that that discomfort and insecurity may have come from singing other people's songs with the pressure that comes with that. By the time his next album comes out, he has become a songwriter. He's written some songs which are some of the most legendary songs of the 20th century. And when he performs them, he does so at a much more measured pace. Here, he's rattling through his inventory. The album comes out in March 1962 and does not do very well at all. Based on the sales alone, Columbia was very tempted to drop him. Hammond went to the wall, insisted that he not drop him, and another person who backed him up to the hilt was another Columbia artist, Johnny Cash. And their faith is justified because less than a year later, the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan comes out and turns the entirety of the 60s on its ear. I've mentioned already the speed at which Dylan is playing on this record. What's also clear is that he hasn't really quite found his voice. He's playing with a number of vocal textures, and the first song on the album, You're No Good, which is a blues by Jesse Fuller, is a good example of him fumbling his way towards that tone, but not yet quite being there. The second song, Talkin' New York, is the first of two originals on the album, and it's basically an autobiographical account of Dylan's arrival in New York, talking about Greenwich Village, and there's that great line at the end about heading west where he says, "So long, New York, howdy East Orange," which of course is a reference to the Gleason's apartment where he would meet Guthrie. There's a large number of traditional tunes on the album, as I mentioned. The next two have actually been made famous by other artists as well. In My Time of Dying, which of course was done by Zeppelin much later, and actually lyrically the content is almost identical. A funny little side note in this song is that the slide that he used to play a slide guitar is actually the lipstick case of his girlfriend Susie Rotolo. The next traditional song is Man of Constant Sorrow, which of course Rod Stewart was to cover later in the decade. It's a very clear, honest, emotional, and compelling vocal delivery, really frankly well beyond his years. That's followed by a great cover of a blues tune by Booker White, Fixin' to Die. That's one of the real highlights of the album. Then Pretty Peggy O, which was a song which the Grateful Dead would later include as a key part of their repertoire. And the final song on side one is Highway 51, which is a Curtis Jones cover. This is another highlight, and what's clear is that Dylan really has a feel. If you listen to Robert Johnson, he never lets the rigid structure of a 12-bar blues get in the way of the feeling of the moment. If he wanted to extend for a couple of bars or abbreviate for a couple of bars, he would do so. Muddy Waters does the same kind of thing. Dylan manages to pull that off. Side two starts with a traditional blues gospel plow, which I gotta say I found a little bit frantic. It's not bad, but it's not exactly the best rendition. But the next song, Baby Let Me Follow You Down, is terrific and much more evocative of where his work would progress. Full of emotion and subtle irony and subtle humor about love and lust, the abandonment of reason. Again, he didn't write it, but it is much more the kind of thing that he would end up doing. The next song is House of the Rising Sun, another traditional, and also the source of a bit of bad feeling because the arrangement here, which is quite subtle, was actually developed by a friend of Bob's called Dave Van Ronk. And Dave had played Bob his arrangement, and Bob had liked it, and then had gone almost immediately to Columbia Records and played that arrangement and put it on his record. Meanwhile, Van Ronk had wanted to record that arrangement on his forthcoming session. There was never much of an apology from Dylan, and there was some, as I say, bad feeling associated to that. The next song is Freight Train Blues, and of course Dylan had arrived in New York on a freight train. This is kind of back to the frantic playing, which doesn't really mar the album, but it certainly is a little too prevalent. Next is Song to Woody, which of course is the other original on the album. It's no real measure of where he would end up as a songwriter. It would stick around in his repertoire for a while, but eventually he'd drop this one and not play it that often. Final song on the album is See That My Grave Is Kept Clean. This is a great performance on guitar by Dylan. It's his own interpretation. He's not trying to sound like a black blues man. He's actually doing his own version, and I think he carries it off very well. The principal defect of the record, as I've mentioned, is his kind of frantic playing, which he engages in from time to time. You can forgive him that because he's basically this coiled up novice who has a whole bunch of stuff to say. He just doesn't really quite know how he's going to say it yet. What happens next, of course, is that he continues to marinate in this soup of musicians, intellectuals, artists, thinkers. He'll begin to write songs which influence and move a whole society and multiple societies, but he's not there yet on this album. The covers are pretty solid. One of the originals is pretty good. There are some glimmers of greatness, and I would say this is a 4 out of 5 star record.